"Keep her in the kitchen with the pots and the mending, where a widow belongs," the housekeeper said, not troubling to lower her voice. "For what use is a woman's grief to his Grace's drawing-room?" I heard it through the half-open door, and I confess my hand tightened so hard upon my cane that the wood groaned. My niece Marian stood not 6 feet away, folding linens, her face perfectly still, as though she had trained herself long ago not to flinch at such words. She had. Grief teaches a woman many disciplines, and silence is the first and cruelest of them. I am Josiah Trent, and I have no claim to greatness beyond this. I was her mother's brother, and when death took first her husband and then, within the year, her infant hopes of ever bearing his child, I was the only kin who did not tell her to be sensible about it. I brought her to Cravenmore because I had been offered a position there as steward of accounts, a modest post for a modest man, and because I could not bear to leave her alone in that cold little cottage with nothing but her weeds and her silence. I did not know, when I brought her, that I was carrying a secret into a house that prized nothing so much as the appearance of having no secrets at all. The house belonged to the Duke of Ashworth, though no one in 3 counties called him that. They called him the Autumn Duke, for the color of his eyes, some said, though I always thought it was for the season of his temperament. A man who had known too many things wither in his hands, and had grown wary of anything that promised to bloom. He was said to be the most feared landlord in the North, sharp-tongued with fools, contemptuous of flattery, and strange for a man of his reputation, a patron of musicians and painters whom he auditioned himself, in that same drawing-room, with a skepticism that had broken lesser talents before they'd finished their first bar. He had buried a father who thought sentiment a weakness, and a younger brother lost at sea, before either man had taught him how to want anything gently, and I think that accounted for the coldness people spoke of, not cruelty exactly, but a long habit of expecting to be disappointed, so that he might never again be surprised into grief. Marian had come to Cravenmore a widow of 22, though she looked older some days and younger on others, the way sorrow ages a face unevenly. Her husband, Thomas Ellery, had been a curate's son with gentle hands and a weak chest, and she had loved him the plain, unremarkable way 2 young people love each other when they expect to have 40 years to prove it and are given 4. I had stood beside her at his graveside in the rain and watched her not weep, which frightened me more than weeping would have, for I had seen grief harden into silence before, in my own mother, and I knew how long such silence could hold a person under before it let them go. When the fever that took the last of her hope for a child followed within the year, I resolved I would not leave her to that cottage and its ghosts, whatever the cost to my own comfort, and so I had written to Cravenmore's steward, an old friend from my clerking days, and begged a place, any place, that would let me bring her somewhere the walls did not remember her husband's coughing. I tell you all this so you will understand what a foolish, reckless thing it was that happened on a Tuesday evening in October, when a candle guttered, a hired pianist failed to arrive from the village on account of a lamed horse, and the Duke's guests, 12 of them, half of London's musical society summoned for a fortnight's house party, sat in his ornate drawing-room with nothing to do but grow restless and unkind. I was there only because his accounts had run long that week, and he'd asked me to bring the ledgers to his study before supper. I found Marian instead, standing just outside the drawing-room with a tray of negus she'd been sent to deliver, listening to Lord Fenwick, a critic of some reputation and less mercy, declare loudly that the North produced nothing but sheep and silence, and that he'd sooner hear a kettle boil than anything a country house could offer by way of music. Then perhaps, said the Duke, in that low, flat voice of his that I had learned meant he was 2 words from throwing a man out of his house, you would do me the courtesy of finding something to listen to before you insult my hospitality further. No one answered him. The pianist was still stranded on the Penrith road. And Marian, who I did not know, who I swear to you I did not know, not in 11 years of loving her, set down her tray, walked past me as though I were a coat stand, and sat down at the great broadwood piano in the corner of that glittering room. I have turned that moment over in my mind 10,000 times since, trying to understand how a woman could keep such a thing from the people who loved her. Later, she told me, it began the year her husband was dying, a quiet consumption that took 8 months to finish its cruel work, when she had taken to playing after midnight, so softly that only the walls could hear, because the music was the only place grief let her set its weight down. She had gone on playing after he was gone, alone in that cottage, on an old upright with 3 dead keys, because a woman who has lost her husband and her hope in the same year needs somewhere to put the howling, and she had found that the piano would hold it for her when nothing else could. She had never played for another living soul. Her own mother had told her, as a girl, that music was a pretty accomplishment for luring a husband and an indulgence unbecoming a widow, and she had believed it, the way we believe the things said to us young, long after we should know better. She did not play a simple waltz that night, though I think that was all anyone expected of her, if they expected anything at all. She played something I had never heard, something I later learned she had been composing in her head for 2 years without ever writing a note of it down, a piece that began so quietly, it seemed at first a mere arrangement of her hands, and then opened, phrase by phrase, into something so full of longing and defiance that I felt my own throat close before I understood I was weeping. The room went silent in the way a room goes silent when it has forgotten how to be anything else. Lord Fenwick's mouth remained slightly open through the whole of it, his glass of negus untouched and warming in his hand. And the Duke, I watched him, because some old instinct told me his face would tell me more than the music itself. The Duke stood absolutely still beside the mantel, his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression I had never once seen him wear in the 3 years I had served in his household. He looked like a man who had been closed for a long time, and had just felt a door swing open somewhere inside him that he had forgotten existed. When she finished, there was a silence long enough that I feared she had shamed herself past recovery, and then the room broke into something between applause and disbelief, and I saw her hands, still resting on the keys, begin very slightly to shake. "Who taught you that?" the Duke asked. He had crossed the room before I realized he'd moved. "No one, Your Grace," she said, rising, smoothing her plain gray skirts as though she might smooth away the whole incident along with them. "It was only foolishness. I forgot myself. I beg you'll forget it too." "I will do no such thing," he said, and something in his voice made Lord Fenwick's eyebrows climb toward his hairline. "That was not foolishness. I have brought composers from Vienna into this room who could not do what you have just done with your eyes half closed and a tray of negus growing cold on the sideboard. Who are you?" "Marian Ellery, Your Grace, Steward Trent's niece. I help in the kitchens and with the linens." She said it like an apology, like a woman handing over her own indictment. I do not know what I expected the Duke to say. I had served men of his rank long enough to know how easily wonder curdles into ownership, how a great man's admiration can become, in the space of a sentence, a demand. But he only looked at her a long moment, and then he said quietly, so that I do not think anyone but she and I were near enough to hear it, "Then Cravenmore has been keeping a very poor accounting of its treasures, Mrs. Ellery. I mean to correct that, if you will permit me." She did not answer him. She curtsied, took up her tray and left the room, and I watched her hands shake all the way down the corridor. That should have been the end of it or the beginning of some ordinary kindness, an extra coin, a word of praise repeated at breakfast and forgotten by supper. It was not the end. The Duke was not an ordinary man in his enthusiasms, and having once seen what she could do, he could not, I think, unset in his mind. He sent for her the following morning, and I went with her, because I did not trust yet what manner of summons it was, feared man or not, patron of the arts or not. He received us in his study, not the drawing-room which I took at the time for a kindness. He did not wish to make a spectacle of what might be a private conversation. He was standing at the window when we entered, and he did not turn at once, which gave me leave to study him. A tall man, broad through the shoulder, dark-haired, with the sort of stillness that comes not from calm but from long practice at containing something else. When he did turn, his eyes went first to Marion, and I saw in that single glance more than I had seen in 3 years of watching him deal with tenants, petitioners, and eager mothers dangling their daughters before him like bait. "I have not slept," he said without preamble, turning over what I heard last night. "I want to know where you learned harmony like that. Not scales, not accomplishment room prettiness. I mean the architecture of it, the way you built that piece like a man builds a bridge so that it could bear the weight you put on it." "I did not learn it anywhere, Your Grace. I only listened to what was in me and set it down as best I could." "That is not nothing. That is the rarest thing I know." He moved toward the pianoforte that stood, I now realized, in the corner of his own study, an instrument I had never once seen him touch. "I keep this room because I am supposed to love music, and mostly I have found reasons to be disappointed by everyone who has sat at that instrument in the last 6 years. I did not expect to be humbled by a woman carrying a tray." "I did not mean to humble anyone." "No," he said, and something almost like a smile crossed his face, gone as quickly as it came. "That is precisely what makes it unbearable, Mrs. Ellery. You did not mean to do anything at all. You simply are what you are, and the rest of us are left standing here having to reckon with it." I ought to have felt only pride in that moment, and I did feel pride, my chest near burst with it, but I felt something else too, a steward's caution, because I had lived long enough in great houses to know that, when a powerful man begins to speak to a poor widow in that tone, the world outside the window rarely lets the tenderness alone. I said as much to her that night, gently, as we sat by the kitchen fire after the house had gone to sleep. "He is a duke, Marion, and you are a steward's niece with a dead husband and no fortune. I have seen what society does to women it decides have risen above their station, talent or no talent." "I know what I am, uncle," she said, and there was an old tiredness in it that broke my heart a little. "I have known it every day since Thomas died. I am not fool enough to think a duke's astonishment is the same as a duke's regard. Tomorrow he will remember I am a widow who serves his table, and the piece will pass into a pleasant memory, and I shall go back to the linens, and that will be the whole of it." She was wrong, though I did not know yet by how much. He did not forget. Within the week he had moved the Broadwood from the drawing-room into a small parlor adjoining the library, a quiet, sun-touched room that had, I later learned, belonged to his late mother, and he asked, not commanded, which from that man was itself a kind of revolution, whether Marion might be permitted an hour each afternoon to play there undisturbed, her household duties adjusted to allow it. My niece, who had spent 11 years believing her gift was a shameful indulgence to be hidden under midnight and closed doors, wept when he told her, and I do not think it was only from gratitude. I think it was the particular grief of being seen, after so long unseen, which can ache worse than being overlooked ever did. He began to come to that parlor himself, in the late afternoons, ostensibly to review correspondence at his mother's old writing desk, though I noticed he answered a remarkably small quantity of correspondence in proportion to the hours he spent there. He would sit, half turned from her, pretending an absorption in his letters, while she played, sometimes old pieces she had half remembered from a governess's lessons decades past, more often the strange, searching compositions of her own devising, pieces with no name yet, pieces that seemed to me to trace the whole shape of her grief and her stubborn, unkillable hope. I watched this courtship, if courtship is the word for two people who scarcely spoke and never touched, unfold across that autumn with the particular anxious tenderness of a man watching someone he loves walk out onto ice he cannot test for her. I saw how the Duke's face changed when she played, the guardedness draining out of it, leaving something almost boyish, almost unbearably open. I saw how Marion, who had walked through Cravenmore for 2 months with her eyes fixed on the middle distance, as widows learn to do, began instead to watch for him, to time her playing to the hour he was likeliest to appear, though she would have denied it to her own confessor. There was an afternoon in late October. I have never been able to set down without my hand trembling a little on the page, so I will set it down plainly and be done with it. I had come to fetch her for supper and found the door of the parlor standing open, and I paused, as I had learned to do, so as not to break whatever fragile thing was forming in that room. She had been playing a slow, unfinished passage, faltering over the same 4 bars again and again, growing visibly frustrated with herself, until at last she stopped altogether and pressed her palms flat against her eyes. "I cannot find the end of it," she said, not knowing, I think, that he had risen from the writing desk and crossed half the room toward her. "It wants to resolve, and I do not know where. It is like grief that way. You expect it to end somewhere, and it simply does not." "Perhaps it need not end at all," he said, very low. "Perhaps it only wants to change key. Grief does that, I've found. It does not vanish. It simply stops being the only note you can hear." He had come to stand beside the instrument, close enough that I saw her hand still trembling faintly over the keys, close enough that when he reached out slowly, as a man reaches toward something he fears will startle and fly, and laid 2 fingers lightly upon the back of her hand where it rested on the wood, neither of them moved for the length of perhaps 3 breaths. It was the smallest touch I have ever seen carry the weight of an entire declaration. Then he withdrew his hand, as though remembering himself, and said only, "Play it again. I should like to hear where it goes whenever you find it," and returned to his desk, and I stood in that doorway with my heart hammering as though I, and not they, had been caught at something forbidden. I did not speak of it to her, nor she to me, but I noticed after that day she no longer merely timed her playing to his likely arrival. She began, very faintly, to hum while she worked in the mornings, an old habit I had not heard from her since before Thomas died, and I understood that whatever had passed between 2 still hands on a piano's edge, it had begun to thaw something in her that I had feared frozen for good. It was in November that he finally said the words I had feared and hoped for in equal measure. I was in the corridor outside the parlor, waiting to walk her back to the kitchens, and the door stood ajar, and I heard him say, in a voice stripped of all its usual iron, "I have spent 6 years telling myself I wanted nothing so much as excellence brought before me, so that I might judge it, elevate it, be its patron and its master. I did not understand, until I sat in this room and listened to you play what you would not even let yourself write down, that what I actually wanted was to be undone by something. I did not know I wanted to be undone until you undid me." "Your Grace." "Edmund," he said, "if you will permit it. I find I cannot bear to be your grace to you any longer, not in this room." I did not hear what she answered, for I stepped away from the door then, feeling I had already trespassed on something too tender for a steward's ears, even a beloved uncle's. But I saw her face when she came out, and it was the face of a woman who had been asked a question she had not dared to hope anyone would ask her again. It could not stay a secret confined to one sunlit parlor, of course. Great houses do not keep such things quiet, and by December the whole of Cravenmore's staff, and no small part of the county, murmured about the Duke and the widow who played for him behind closed doors. Some of it was kind murmuring. Much of it was not. Lord Fenwick, who had never quite forgiven the evening he'd been proven a fool by a tray-bearing servant, took it upon himself to remark at dinner, within her hearing, that he supposed his Grace meant to found an orchestra of chambermaids next, and that a woman who plinked out parlor tunes for her own comfort was hardly fit to be spoken of as an artist among artists. Marian said nothing to this. She had spent her whole life saying nothing to such remarks, and I confess I expected nothing different now. But the Duke, who had overheard it as Fenwick no doubt intended him to, set down his glass with a care that was more frightening than any shout and said, "I am glad you raised the question of fitness, Fenwick, because I have been meaning to settle it. I am opening the recital hall for a public evening at the new year. Mrs. Ellery will perform. You, and every critic and connoisseur I can persuade to travel this far north in January, will be there to hear her. I find I am no longer content to keep what I have discovered folded away in a private parlor as though I were ashamed of it. Let the whole of London judge for itself whether a widow from a steward's household has anything worth their attention. I saw Marian's face go white, and I understood her fear better than anyone at that table, for I had watched her mother's warning settle into her bones 30 years before any of us had met the Duke. To be seen quietly, by one man who loved her, was a mercy she had scarcely dared accept. To be seen publicly, by a room of the very people whose scorn had taught her to hide herself in the first place, was another matter entirely, and that night, when I found her in the kitchen long after the house was dark, she was not composing. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, perfectly still, the old fear plain on her face. "I cannot do it, uncle. I have spent my whole life being told a woman's gift is a private, shameful thing, meant for midnight and closed doors, and now he asks me to carry it out into a hall full of strangers who will judge not only the music but me, a widow, a servant's niece, a nobody who dared to think herself worth hearing." "Marian," I took her hands, which were cold despite the banked fire. "I watched your mother tell you that music was no fit occupation for a respectable woman, and I said nothing, because I was young and thought it was not my place to contradict my own sister. I have regretted my silence every year since, as I watched you fold that gift smaller and smaller until you thought it fit only for an empty room at midnight. I will not be silent now. That piece you played the night the pianist failed to come, I have heard it in my head every day since, and I promise you, whatever those people in that hall think of your dress or your rank or your widow's cap, they will not be able to unhear what you make them feel. Let them come expecting a curiosity. Let them leave having witnessed the truth. And if I fail, if I sit down at that instrument, before all of London and my hands forget everything they know, then you will have failed honestly, doing the one thing you were always meant to do, instead of succeeding quietly at pretending you were never meant to do it at all. I know which failure I would rather watch you risk." She did not answer me that night, but 3 days later she went to the Duke and told him she would play. It was not so simple a matter as her deciding it, and the rest of the household falling silent in approval. The housekeeper, Mrs. Radcliffe, the same woman whose remark had opened this account, and who never once in all the months that followed softened toward my niece, took it upon herself to inform the other maids that a servant playing at being a lady would only end in the servant's humiliation and the house's disgrace, and I overheard 2 of the younger girls repeating it in the scullery, as though it were settled fact rather than one bitter woman's spite. Marian heard it too, I am certain, for the walls of a great house carry gossip the way water carries cold, and though she said nothing of it to me, I noticed she took to practicing later at night again, as she had in her cottage, as though some old instinct told her that safety still lay in the dark, rather than the light she had only just been given permission to stand in. I confronted her about it directly, for I had promised myself I would not let her retreat back into the silence I had watched her mother teach her. "You are allowed to want this in the daylight, Marian. You need not apologize for it by hiding again." "I am not hiding, uncle. I am only afraid that if I let myself believe it too fully in the daylight, I shall not survive the losing of it." It was the most honest thing she had said to me in 11 years, and it undid me rather more than I let her see. The weeks that followed were, I think, the fullest and most frightened weeks of her life. She composed in earnest now, no longer stealing fragments of feeling in a private hour, but building deliberately the piece she meant to set before the world, refining the composition she had first played by instinct into something she shaped with her whole waking mind, hour after hour, while the Duke sat nearby correcting no correspondence at all, simply listening, simply watching her become, in full daylight, the thing she had always been in the dark. I brought her tea one evening and found sheets of manuscript paper scattered across the parlor floor, each one marked with crossings out so fierce the nib had torn the page in places. She had reached, she told me, the passage that troubled her most, the turn where the piece must decide whether to end in grief or in hope, and she could not, for the longest while, make her hand choose. Thomas would have told me hope was the braver choice, she said, gathering the pages into some rough order. He always thought me the braver of the two of us, though I never believed him. I told her I thought a woman who had buried a husband and a hope for a child, and still sat down each day to build something beautiful out of the wreckage of both, had answered that question long before her pen ever needed to. She did not reply, but she wrote until well past midnight, and when I came to fetch the tea things away, the ending she had found was not the mournful one she had feared, nor a false, easy gladness, but something braided of both, which I have come to think is the truest sound grief ever makes once it has been given enough light to grow toward. He did more than listen. He wrote in his own hand to every musician and critic of consequence he had ever patronized, inviting them not to curiosity but, in his words, to witness the finest new composition he had encountered in a decade. He had the recital hall, a handsome, high-windowed chamber attached to the west wing, unused for public occasion since his father's time, refitted with new candelabra and fresh gilding, as though for a coronation rather than a widow's first performance. When I asked him, half in jest, whether he did not fear making a fool of himself should the room judge her harshly, he looked at me with an intensity that silenced any further jesting. I have spent my whole adult life being feared, Trent, and being right, and being lonely in the particular way that comes from never once being surprised. I would rather be a fool for her sake than be right and untouched for the rest of mine. I am not afraid of the room. I am afraid only that I waited so long to hear her that I might have lost her to her own fear before I ever had the chance. He had not lost her, but I will not pretend the days before the recital passed without one further trial, for society does not surrender its cruelties without a final effort. 3 days before the appointed evening, Lord Fenwick called at Cravenmore uninvited, and I was in the hall when he found her arranging music in the parlor, and I heard him say, in that carrying, contemptuous voice of his, meant for an audience even when he pretended it was private, "You would do well to withdraw, Mrs. Ellery, before you embarrass yourself and his grace both. A pretty parlor trick performed for a besotted duke is one thing. A public hall full of London's finest ears is quite another, and I promise you, they will not be as generously deceived as he has been. I have never in my life wanted so badly to strike a man, cane and all, but it was Marian who answered him, and her voice, when it came, held none of the tremor I feared. You called me a chambermaid with a tune, my lord, the week I first sat at that piano, and you were wrong then. You are welcome to sit in that hall on Thursday and be wrong again. In front of every witness you have gathered to watch you be wrong. I have stopped being ashamed of what I can do. I find I have no more room left to be ashamed of what you think of me." He left without another word, and I confess I laughed aloud once he was out of the house, though Marian did not laugh with me. She only looked, I thought, a little more like a woman who had decided, finally, to stop apologizing for the size of her own soul. That night, unable to sleep, I walked the long gallery toward the west wing and found the Duke standing alone at the doors of the recital hall, watching the workmen scaffolding by lantern light as though he might, by sheer force of attention, will the room into worthiness. I did not mean to intrude upon his thoughts, but he heard my cane upon the flagstones and did not send me away. "Do you think me a fool, Trent, for staking so much of my name on one evening? I think you a man who has finally found something worth the staking, your grace, which is a different matter entirely from folly. Fenwick will tell every drawing-room in London that I have lost my judgment along with my heart." "Then let him," I said, more boldly than a steward ought to address a duke, though by then I believed he had stopped hearing me as merely his steward's uncle and had begun, in some quiet way, to hear me as her family. I buried her husband, your grace. I watched her fold herself smaller every year after, until I feared there would be nothing left of the girl I remembered. Whatever Thursday brings, you have already given her back more of herself than 11 years of grief left her. I do not think a man who has done that is the one history will call the fool. He did not answer me, but he clasped my hand before I left him, which was, from a man of his reputed coldness, answer enough. The night of the recital, the hall filled with a crowd such as Cravenmore had not seen in a generation, critics down from London, musicians of genuine reputation, half the county's gentry drawn as much by curiosity as by the Duke's considerable persuasion, and Lord Fenwick seated prominently in the second row, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man determined to be disappointed on schedule. Every candle in the new candelabra had been lit, so that the whole room glowed gold, and the freshly gilded moldings threw the light back twice over, until even the skeptics filing to their seats could not help but look up and murmur at the transformation the Duke had wrought in a room that had stood shuttered for a generation. I sat near the back with the household staff, who had begged and connived their way into the gallery to see one of their own step out from behind the linens and the tea trays, and I do not think there was a soul among them who was not praying for her as fervently as I was. She came out in a gown the Duke had insisted upon providing, simple and unadorned beside the diamonds and silk of the ladies in the front rows, and I saw several eyebrows lift at the plainness of her, and I saw Fenwick's mouth curl in a way I recognized and despised. She did not look at any of them. She sat at the great instrument, folded her hands a moment as though gathering the whole of her grief and her love and her long years of silence into her palms, and began to play. I will not try to describe the piece to you as music, for I have not the vocabulary, only the memory of what it did to the room. It began, as it had that first night, so quietly that the hall itself seemed to lean forward to hear it, a single line unfolding like a held breath finally released, and I thought of every evening I had heard its early fragments drifting from that sunlit parlor and never known, until that moment, how much larger a thing she had been building than any of us understood. Then it opened, phrase by phrase, into something that carried within it every year of her hidden grief and every year of her hidden hope. I heard in it the cottage with its 3 dead keys, the rain at Thomas's graveside, the long midnights when she had believed no one would ever hear her but the walls, and then, rising beneath all of that old sorrow, something new and unmistakably alive, a melody that climbed rather than mourned, until I could no longer tell whether the tightness in my chest was grief for all she had suffered or joy, that she had finally been permitted to set it down where the world could hear it. The hall itself seemed to hold its breath with her. I saw women in silk weeping into their gloves and men who had built careers on their skepticism sitting utterly motionless, mouths parted, forgetting to perform the boredom they had arrived prepared to wear. I saw Lord Fenwick's arms slowly uncross, and then, unmistakably, his eyes glisten, though he would deny it to his dying day. I saw the Duke, standing at the side of the hall where he had insisted on remaining rather than sitting among his guests, watching her with an expression that needed no music master to translate. Awe, plain and complete, and beneath it something steadier and warmer that I understood at last, to be the particular devotion of a man who has stopped merely admiring a woman and started needing her the way he needs breath. I do not think he blinked from the first note to the last. When the final chord faded, the silence held for 3 full heartbeats, long enough that I feared, absurdly, after all of it, that the room had somehow failed to understand what it had just witnessed. And then it broke all at once, into an ovation such as I had never heard in any hall, the guests rising to their feet, and I saw even Fenwick rise stiffly, as though his body had decided the matter before his pride could object. The Duke did not wait for the applause to finish. He crossed the hall in full view of every person who had come to judge her, climbed the steps to the small stage, and took her hands in his before the whole assembled company of London's finest ears and Cravenmore's watching household alike. 3 months ago, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of that hall, though I do not think he was speaking to the crowd at all. I was told a widow in my kitchens knew nothing of music beyond what she might hum over a mending basket. I have never in my life been so grateful to be wrong. I would rather be undone by her 1,000 times than be right and untouched for one more day. Marian Ellery, I do not care what any person in this hall believes a duchess ought to be. I have found the only woman I intend to spend the rest of my life listening to, and I will not spend one more hour pretending otherwise. I do not know precisely what she said to him, for the hall had erupted again, and my own eyes were too full to be of much use to me as a witness. But I saw her hand rise to his face, and I saw him bow his head to meet it, and I saw, in that gesture, the whole of what I had watched grow between them since a lamed horse and a guttering candle had forced a grieving widow to sit down at a piano she had sworn never to touch before strangers. The days between the recital and the wedding passed, I confess, in a kind of happy blur I have never fully managed to untangle in memory, callers arriving from as far as London to beg an introduction to the Cravenmore composer, as the newspapers had already taken to calling her, Mrs. Radcliffe growing suddenly, suspiciously attentive to Marian's comfort, which Marian bore with more grace than I could have managed. Lord Fenwick himself sending, without a word of explanation, a fine folio of manuscript paper for whatever Mrs. Ellery composes next, which I took, and still take, for the nearest thing to an apology that proud man's pen was capable of producing. Through it all Marian moved as though she were only just learning the shape of her own life, testing each new kindness carefully before she let herself trust it, the way a woman does who has been taught for too long that good things are borrowed rather than given. They married in the spring, in the same recital hall, because Marian asked for it that way, saying she wished her wedding to happen in the one room where she had stopped being afraid of herself. The workmen's scaffolding was long gone by then, and in its place stood banks of white and gold flowers, and the same broadwood that had first betrayed her secret stood, draped in ribbon near the altar, silent for once, though I think everyone in that hall understood it as the truest witness among us. I stood as near to her as a proud old uncle is permitted to stand, and when the vows were spoken and the Duke lifted her hand to his lips before the whole assembled county, the same county that had once been content to leave her folding linens in a housekeeper's shadow, I thought of her mother's old warning, that music was no fit occupation for a respectable woman, and I thought that if there is any justice left in this world for widows who have been told to make themselves small, it is this: that the gift she was taught to be ashamed of became the very thing that let the whole world finally see her exactly as she was. I will confess one further thing before I close this account, though it is a small thing, and perhaps only a foolish old uncle would think it worth the telling. At the wedding breakfast, when the toasts had all been made and the guests had scattered into the gardens to admire the last of the spring roses, I found Marian alone for a moment beside the broadwood, resting her hand upon its closed lid, the way one rests a hand upon the shoulder of an old and faithful friend. "Do you remember," she said, without turning, "what Mrs. Radcliffe said the day you overheard her in the corridor, that there was no use in a widow's grief in a duke's drawing-room? I remember it as though it were spoken an hour ago. I think of it often now. Not with anger any longer, I find I have no room left for that either, but because I want to remember what it cost me to believe her, and how nearly I let her be right." She looked up at me then, and there were tears standing in her eyes, though she was smiling through them in the way I had come, in that one short year, to know as entirely her own. "You never once let me believe her, uncle. Whatever happens to me for the rest of my life, I want you to know I have not forgotten that it was you who refused to be silent when everyone else thought silence was kindness." I could not answer her for a moment, for my own throat had closed the way it had that first night in the drawing-room, 11 months before, when I had not yet understood what I was watching. I only took her hand, the same hand that had undone a duke and a critic and an entire skeptical hall in the space of one composition, and held it as I had held it at her christening, at her wedding to poor Thomas, at her husband's grave, and now here, at the beginning of whatever came next. She still plays every evening in that sunlit parlor that was once his mother's, and the Duke still sits nearby, pretending at correspondence he never finishes, and I have never in all my years witnessed a man listen to anything the way he listens to her, as though every note were a fresh proof that the world had, after everything, given him back more than it ever took away. I was only her uncle, only a steward with a ledger and a cane, but I will go to my own grave certain that I witnessed the truest thing I ever saw in that great house. Not a duke choosing a duchess, but a man finally hearing, in full, the voice a woman had been forced to whisper her whole life long, and refusing for the rest of both their lives to let it ever go quiet again.